It's 1:30 p.m. on March 29, 2023. I will be reviewing a series of documents that I found as what I understand to be a supplement or a follow-up to a series of documents that were issued under the administration of Secretary of State James A. Baker III. The original documents were dated for January 6th during the 1980s. They came up in response to the allegations of the events that occurred on January 6th, 2021 at the United States Capitol building, which, by the way, was exactly 1 year after the Senate ended up passing a bill that I attempted to petition the Supreme Court of the United States for regarding charges of impeachment against the United States Senate for their unanimous voice vote consent to the approval of that bill that I contend was a violation of the Fourth Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment. My petition was dated for January 13th, and I did receive a response from the Supreme Court of the United States, along with, in addition, that was provided as part of the response from the Supreme Court. That petition has since been stolen, and I contend it has been used in massive crimes. Inclusive in those crimes is the fact that I contend the response from the Supreme Court and the information regarding the mailing on that particular package that included my original petition and letter that had been stamped by the Supreme Court, and what they included as part of the response that also included a letter from them was connected to a long-term security issue to the United States Treasury, i.e., the court sent me its bond, and somebody has since stolen it and used it for crime. That was a year before the events at the Capitol building on January 6th of 2021. I had, around that time, found information, identifying information was presented under the administration of Secretary of State James A. Baker, and I say that because it was through the State Department, regarding compliance with excise taxes for gasoline. Now, at the time, the manner in which the presentation of the information was provided in the electronic record featured a two-page letter by Baker that had a light blue background. I've been investigating the use of these blue-sheeted communications, including these light blue-sheeted communications provided by the Congress itself when it provides an electronic background of a light blue color for only temporary periods of time in connection with pending legislation, including pending legislation that's been referred to committee and may be at various stages of passage within the respective House or Senate proceeding. There have been 3 of those that I've been able to identify since 2019, and I had engaged the process of tracking them. It was in the course of this that I found this information from Secretary Baker. The information I have now is a document that is, as I have it here, is 31 pages involving a number of correspondences. I'm going to review them now at this time. I will say, in addition, in May of 1992, there was a congressional hearing regarding a 4.3-cent excise tax related to gasoline. In the course of that congressional hearing, there were 3 stages of testimony that were provided. I contended that what it actually showed was some form of congressional production arrangement at the level of Congress. And the testimony in the first 2 sections, which are the only sections at the time I reviewed, actually demonstrated what I contend was actually a demonstrable pattern that had been put into effect that also was a major security, including in connection with the manners in which the gas and oil sector is connected to other national security level matters, and that the information provided in regards to transportation within the United States was specifically compelling. Now, unfortunately, in the last several years, I have not been able to find that original document. I had downloaded it, and I had it in my evidence on one of a number of thumb drives that were stolen on September 21st of 2021. I'm following up at this time, and I will be providing a review as I review these documents right now. Okay, the first 2 documents are provided by Sapel Resources Company and then Sapel and Associates Incorporated Petroleum Landmen. They're both dated for December 19th, 1984, and they appear to be identical in terms of content. One says it's signed by Bob Sapel. The other one says it's signed by Bob J. Sapel, Jr. These are the first 2 of the documents. In connection with the areas it brings up, one of the things it mentions is intangible drilling expenses, percentage depletion and investment tax credits. One of the first questions that comes from this is an understanding of the relationship of small wells and the provision of distribution concerning production. Specifically in the state of Texas, it's been known that up to 20% of the actual drilling is done by major companies. However, up to 80% of distribution is provided by those same companies, including insofar as a contract with the small well owners in order to provide the distribution. The small well owners do not have the capacity to do the distribution on their own, and so they contract with the larger oil companies. So the percentage of the actual drilling that is conducted by the larger companies is to be evaluated relative to the percentage regarding the distribution of the resources at hand. Now, the information I have is part of securities that also include books that, by the way, were attempted for destruction within the last 9 months. And these are, there's two different reference points that provide the same information. My understanding is that since the time they were provided, which is not before the dates on these letters, the information and the context within which to evaluate that information needed to be addressed respectively. I will obtain those two documents, and I will update the information regarding the time frame within which they were written for that information, and I will double check on more contemporary information regarding specifically the proportion of drilling to distribution for large companies versus the portion of drilling to distribution regarding the smaller companies. The next letter is dated for December 21st, 1984 by MC Energy Incorporated. It does also include a list of CCs to numerous persons besides the Honorable James A. Baker III. Two of the things that it brings up are actually, at least one of them, is relevant in consideration of the first two letters, specifically discussing the first item, repeal of expensing of intangible drilling cost. It also says, and investment tax credits. It's just understood that the majority of costs for gas and oil drilling are in intangible drilling cost. I contend the substance and the nature of what specifically constitutes a intangible drilling cost is something that needs to be further explicated, including affirmatively supported in the context of providing a legal contextualization for the inclusiveness of them as intangible drilling cost, including the identification of what the intangible is. My understanding is that as recently as the time frame during which this was being considered, and insofar as I understand it, that has not changed much since, that up to 80% of costs are considered to be intangible drilling costs. So the consideration of what he says later regarding them as investments, and the other thing that he is discussing in here regarding the understanding of these as expenses. What is the alternative to identifying these as expenses? And see, this is a very significant matter, including if one is asking for some sort of tax relief or is requesting a consideration regarding what is identifiable as a tax credit. These two matters are still very applicable now and very relevant for consideration. The next letter is by John C. Robbins. It's dated for December 10th, 1984. Among the things it discusses, the first paragraph, it identifies price drops, including one identified at 20 to 25%, and then another, as it says, certain categories dropping up to 50%. But in the second paragraph, it discusses, and quote, the ripple effect causes energy loans to become bad or non-performing, end quote. What is the context for consideration of these so-called energy loans? It has been a source of contention for the last several years here in the United States. According to a report provided by the Office of Comptroller of Currency regarding the semi-annual risk perspective, as of 2018 and 2019, reports that were issued concerning data from 2017 had correlating information that has since been altered in the official government documents. The first piece of information that is altered had to do with the real estate market, specifically mortgages for single-family homes, and the context within which certain loans and percentages of loans were paying on interest as opposed to principal. Then there is the consideration that concurrent to this time, the OCC identified the gas and oil sector had engaged in temporary 5-year loans that had terms coming due in the near future. The year 2019 at the time was reported as a major year when a plurality, or rather a majority in terms of each year, was going to be the context wherein these loans were going to start coming due, with there being different percentages that were to decrease because the majority were to have already come due before then. Since then, this information has been reported both in public media, including in the energy sector, but also it has been reflected differently in the OCC reports, including ones from that time, following the announcement of COVID-19 and beginning, at least according to the records I had, as early as the late summer of 2020. What is the actual status of the current alleged short-term 5-year loans that were provided to the gas and oil sector in the United States? The last time I checked, which was around this time last year, they said those loans were going to start coming due last year. I contend that that is false information. That according to the OCC, in the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, majority of those loans were supposed to have already been paid back before 2022. Was something comparable going on in the 80s? I'm now reviewing the next letter. I am not going to finish reading the entire letter before I comment because just in the first half of the first page, two major things come up. This letter is by Ben P. Rawler. It's dated for December 18, 1984. One of the first things it says is, quote, if these entities were disallowed percentage depletion and were required to capitalize intangible drilling costs, drilling by these entities would come to an abrupt halt, end quote. That's identified in the first paragraph, i.e. discussing what would it entail or what would be entailed in the recording of the intangible drilling cost in a performance of capitalization as opposed to some other manner in which to account for it. This is important because it is becoming very aware. In 2005, the European system implemented changes to accounting regarding gas and oil, as well as an overhaul of regards accounting for other kinds of resources. When it came to the accounting procedures, that marked a significant difference in terms of how accounting was performed regarding gas and oil among the European system, which a number of countries outside of Europe also adhere to, versus the American system. Now, the information I have was actually an accounting book that was published in 2005 in anticipation that the updates to the European system were going to be put into effect by the end of 2005. Now, the second thing to consider here is very significantly right at the beginning, facts to be considered. Number one, he's talking about the, quote, heavy front-end tax load in the year the well is drilled. End quote. This is important because what else was going on in the 1980s regarding natural resources and considerations of, quote, heavy front-end tax load, including proportion on what are called swaps regarding natural resources, including natural resources that were being administered by trust through a nonprofit organization that over subsequent years, when there were different swap deals engaged, included that specific nonprofit being put into the role of an actual capital holder at an increased rate while they adjusted for the consideration of the period of interest payment on the swap deals versus the interest, the payment on principal for those particular deals. There is a direct trajectory of the change in what would be considered, quote, the heavy front-end tax load, end quote, in connection with interest payments versus principal payments in connection with swap deals that were begun around this time in the 1980s. If I recall correctly, first swap deal of concern involved the timber sector in Mexico. These are specifically timber sector swap deals that happened in a number of countries, both in Central and South America, but also in the Eastern Hemisphere, including in Southeast Asia, but also including in Africa. By the end of 2017, I believe the third of these swap deals, which involved the nation of Honduras, was supposed to have been completed. These swap deals were for between 20 and 25 years. My understanding is that we may well be in the period where the majority, if not all, of those initial swap deals have at least allegedly come due. And I've heard nothing about the status on the final outtake or the final implication, the implementation of those swap deals in the countries of concern. But there have been other matters that provide a form of derivative reporting, including in connection with what would otherwise be considered either the timber sector or would be considered forest reserves that would be off limits in consideration of the timber sector in the countries of concern as well as other countries. The second point he identifies, quote, in the past, independent producers have reinvested 112% of their generated funds in drilling activities, end quote. And again, this gets into considerations of what are considered to be intangible drilling costs. Do these intangible drilling costs involve production arrangements based upon some form of legal action, up to and including any sort of litigation that is engaged either by or against the company of concern, or in connection with other factors associated with the drilling? 3, he says, quote, it appears that the Treasury, either consciously or inadvertently, is dismissing the majority of independents and turning over the oil and natural gas business almost completely to the majors, end quote. Again, this goes back to the consideration not only of the actual drilling of the well, but also the distribution and in what manner independent well owners are able to access distribution in order to maintain their production. Additionally, this also brings up another point that was already discussed in an earlier letter that I have not yet mentioned, which is Okay. Point 11, it discusses, quote, had this been the case, OPEC's influence over both markets and prices would have been further strengthened, end quote, discussing the drilling of new wells since 1979. Again, this is a matter pertaining to distribution. What kind of costs are incurred to foreign-based oil companies, or including cartels such as OPEC, when it comes to distribution domestically? Point 12 is important. He says, quote, to do this, domestic production would have to increase to an average rate of 11.2 million barrels per day, ... end quote. Is that comparable to the 112% that was reinvested? Sounds like, again, a capital outlay. But additionally, it also says, quote, to move from our present rate of about 8.8 million barrels per day, ... This 8.8 keeps coming up very frequently. As a matter of fact, it came up just this morning. But this 8.8 has been a very significant matter, including, as I first identified it in early 2017, in January of 2017, but it has persisted up until now. 8.8 or 88 as a metric has been identified specifically with what? Distribution. readily associated with distribution, including going all the way back to 1998. And the means by which to associate it with distribution were set up in 1988. But this is perhaps the first evidence I have seen of an indication of that 8.8 metric predating 1988. Point 13, he says, quote, in either case, the bulk of production needed in the early 1990s must come from reserves not yet found, end quote. This is very important because not only does this involve the definition of what constitutes a reserve, but the context wherein the provability of the reserve is defined. What is the context around which to identify production arrangements that include standards associated with what is considered to be the provability of the reserve when it comes to development? Now, this is identifying specifically the early 1990s. Number 14, there are three parts of number 14, but what does number 14 tear to? I contend the question is, does 1984 tear to 1974, including when the Office of Comptroller of Currency, in connection with the Department of Treasury, began a process of a 3-year term, which, by the way, 3-year term was already identified in an earlier letter, during which the Department of Treasury was comparing the implementation of a betterment accounting system versus another kind of tax system for the railroad industry between the years of 1974 and 1977. And reports that was released by the Department of Treasury had said that the United States Congress had spent nearly 60 years attempting to negotiate a revision of the accounting process, and also included a consideration of taxation on the railroad sector. It had been approved in the early 1970s. There was some contestation from the railroad sector, and so there was a period engaged where there was actually a survey that lasted 3 years to compare the accounting processes were the old system to be used versus the system that had been legislatively authorized. I have done a report evaluating this. The anniversary of this OCC report came due in when? February of 2021. But the important thing is that, as I recall, the beginning of the period under survey was in 1974. So how do these alleged tax changes or these proposed tax changes to the gas and oil sector compare with the proposed tax changes to the railroad sector 10 years earlier? The final element of the letter, Waller appears to be identifying something that is a process that would otherwise be reserved to the state. As an independent, and he identifies himself as an independent well owner, my understanding is this process of condemnation is actually something that's reserved to the state. Next letter by Aikman Brothers, December 17th, 1984, signed by William H. Aikman. I'm not going to continue reading this letter. What does he say? And he brings up something that might actually be important in the beginning of the second paragraph, but how does he contextualize it in the third? I'm going to read this directly as it says. I also feel the word, quote, subsidize, end quote, in the release was inappropriate. It's like saying, quote, have you stopped beating your wife, end quote. Yes, there are incentives, but whoever paid me in cash for a dry hole, end quote. I'm not going to read the rest of this letter.